Have you ever wondered what the final straw is that makes a gentle mother decide she can no longer endure? In a garden filled with the scent of jasmine, under a sky heavy with the promise of rain, a six-year-old woman suddenly made a decision that would change everything. And just a few hours later, beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers and the echo of music, the glittering gala of the city's elite turned into a scene of stunned silence. One bold action flipped the entire room upside down, like a chessboard overturned before hundreds of eyes. If you were the one witnessing it, how would you look at that mother? Comment below and let us know which city you're watching this story from. And don't forget to keep following the story on Deepu Cater Stories. The Upset. My name is Vivian Sinclair, and I am 66 years old. And tonight, I am the reason the most exclusive charity gala in Atlanta has ground to a halt. Right now, as I sit here in the quiet of my garden, my son's wife, Cassandra, is standing under a crystal chandelier, her face a mask of frozen disbelief. The city's elite, the men and women who run this town, are staring, their champagne glasses paused halfway to their lips. Two police detectives are speaking to her, their voices low, but their presence is as loud as a siren. And on Cassandra's finger is my ring, a $3 million ring she thought was a worthless trinket. The party is upside down. Her life is upside down, and I am the one who turned it over. It all began an hour ago, with a simple text message, a vibration against the cool glass of my sweet tea. I was in my garden, the one my late husband Leo and I cultivated for 40 years. Trying to find a little peace, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and coming rain. Then I read the words from Cassandra. Borrowing that old ring of yours for the gala? Viv, it's the perfect touch. Hope you don't mind. Viv, a name as small and insignificant as she believed I was. I read it once, then again, and something inside me, something that had been dormant for a decade, finally woke up. It was a cold, quiet fury. For 10 years, I had been a ghost in my own home, a silent witness to my own slow erasure. I had watched her, my son Julian's wife, redecorate my memories, dismiss my opinions, and manage my existence with a bright, condescending smile. I had watched my own son stand by and let it happen, all in the name of keeping the peace, his peace. Notmina, that text message was not a request. It was a final act of appropriation, a declaration that everything I had, everything I was hers for the taking. And in that moment, I decided she was wrong. I walked into the house, my hands steady, my purpose clear. I did not call my son. I did not text her back. I sat down in Leo's old leather chair, the one that still holds the faint scent of his pipe tobacco, and I made a call. Milavir. Frank Miller was Leo's oldest friend. He knows our history. He knows the weight of our legacy. Frank, I said, and the voice that came out was calm and clear. It's Vivian. Vivian, good to hear you. Everything all right? No, I said. The word was a stone dropping into a still well. Frank, I need to activate the protocol for the Leo Sinclair Trust. Item 7B. It has been taken without my authorization. There was a pause. Frank knew the trust document inside and out. He knew that item 7B was the centerpiece. A 5-carat pink diamond ring valued and insured for $3 million. He knew what activating the protocol meant. Vivian, he said, his voice now serious. That means filing a report for grand larceny. Police will be dispatched immediately. Are you absolutely certain? I looked out the window at the old magnolia tree, its branches thick and unyielding. It had survived storms I thought would break it. Yes. Frank, I said, I'm sure. And that is how we arrived here. To this moment, Frank called the insurance company, and the insurance company, facing a $3 million loss, called their contacts high up in the Atlanta PD. They didn't send a patrol car. They sent 2 of their best property crimes detectives. I can picture the scene now. Frank is narrating it to me over the phone. His voice a low, steady hum in my ear. He's there, at the back of the ballroom, watching. He tells me the detectives approached her quietly. He says Cassandra laughed at first. A high, tinkling sound meant to charm and dismiss. She put a hand on Julian's arm. "Oh, darling, can you believe it?" she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your mother is having one of her episodes. She sent the police after me for borrowing a piece of costume jewelry. But the detectives did not smile. One of them," Frank says, "simply opened a file. 'Ma'am,' he said, his voice cutting through her performance. 'The ring on your finger is item 7B of the Leo Sinclair Trust, insured for $3 million. We are here to recover stolen property.'" Frank tells me a silence fell over the room. A heavy, absolute silence. He says the color drained from Cassandra's face. That Julian looked as though he had been struck. $3 million. A number so large, so undeniable. It shattered her entire narrative in an instant. The story she had so carefully crafted for 10 years. The story of the dotty, confused old mother-in-law and the patient, benevolent daughter-in-law was gone, replaced by a simpler one. The story of a thief. The party is over. The real story is just beginning, and I am the one who will tell it. 10 years of silence. It's strange. You don't realize a house has a soul until it's gone. This house, the one Leo and I poured our lives into, used to have a soul. It was made of the low notes from a jazz record on a Sunday morning, the smell of chicory coffee brewing in the kitchen, and the deep, rumbling sound of my husband's laughter. It was a place that felt solid, grounded. Now, the silence here is so loud it hums. Cassandra didn't steal the soul of this house all at once. She dismantled it, piece by piece. So slowly you could almost convince yourself it wasn't happening. It began with the furniture. My furniture. The pieces Leo and I had chosen, each one with a story. They started to disappear. First, the old armchair where Leo used to read the paper. It was replaced by a sleek, white thing that was cold to the touch and impossible to get comfortable in, just freshening things up. "Viv," she'd said, smiling her bright, empty smile, bringing the place into the 21st century. My son, Julian, saw nothing wrong. He saw a modern house, a stylish wife. He didn't see the erasure. He didn't see his father's chair. A piece of his own history, being hauled away by strangers. Then, she started on me. It was a campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts. If friends came to visit, she would greet them at the door and steer them into the formal living room. "Let's give Viv some space," she would say, her voice full of false sweetness. "She has her little routines, and we wouldn't want to disturb her." My life wasn't a little routine. It was my life. But she said it so often, with such conviction, that even I started to believe it. I became a disturbance in my own home, a fragile antique to be handled with care and kept out of the main flow of traffic. The worst part was how she used my age against me, how she planted the seeds of doubt in my own son's mind. A few years ago, I misplaced a small, silver locket. It was nothing of monetary value, but it was the first gift Leo ever gave me. I searched everywhere. I was frantic. I knew I had left it on my dresser. I heard her talking to Julian later that night. Her voice a low, concerned murmur from the kitchen. I stood in the shadows of the hallway, listening. "It's happening more and more." "Julian," she whispered. She was so sure about the locket. "It worries me. Her memory is getting worse." And Julian, my son, replied with a heavy sigh. A sigh I had come to know so well. It was the sound of his weariness, the sound of him giving up. She found the locket a week later, at the bottom of her own handbag. "Oh, silly me," she'd laughed, handing it back to me. "It must have fallen in when I was tidying up your room. You really should be more careful with your things." Viv. She twisted it, so that her mistake became my carelessness. Her violation became my confusion. It was brilliant, in its own cruel way. And Julian was just so relieved that the locket was found. He never questioned how it got there. He never questioned the lie. He doesn't understand what this house means. What the Leo Sinclair Trust represents. Julian was born into this comfort. He doesn't remember the early days, when Leo and I were just two young black kids from the Ninth Ward, with a dream that was bigger than our bank account. He doesn't know the sting of being told no by a dozen banks, or the quiet pride of finally getting that yes. This trust, the money, the assets, it's not just wealth. It's a fortress built of sleepless nights and shrewd decisions and a stubborn refusal to fail. It is the story of a family that built something permanent in a world that often treated them as temporary. And I stood by, silently, while the daughter-in-law he brought into that fortress treated its queen like a servant. I did it because I saw the look in his eyes every time a disagreement brewed. A look of sheer exhaustion. A silent plea. Please, Mom, just let it go. For me, and so I did. For him, I let go of my place at the head of the table. I let go of my stories. I let go of my voice. I let it all go. Piece by piece. Until there was almost nothing left. I see now, in the deafening quiet of this waiting, that I wasn't protecting him. I was enabling her. My silence wasn't a sacrifice. It was a mistake. And tonight, for the first time in 10 years, the price of that mistake is finally being paid, just not by me. The Ring's true story. Frank is still on the phone, his voice a low murmur in my ear. But I am barely listening. My mind is not in that glittering ballroom. With its whispers and its flashing phone cameras, my mind is here, in this house, traveling back through time, back to a place that Cassandra Thorne could never understand. You see, she thinks this is about money. $3 million. It is a shocking number. A number designed to make people gasp. But the truth is, if that ring had been worth $3, I would have done the same thing, because its value was never in the diamond. Its value was in the journey it took to get to my finger. The ring was not from Leo. Not originally. It belonged to his mother, Esther Sinclair. Now, Esther was a woman carved from Georgia granite. She was born in a time and place where a black woman had to be harder, smarter, and stronger than everyone around her just to survive. She raised Leo on her own after his father passed, turning a small neighborhood grocery store into a thriving business through sheer will. She did not bend. She did not break. And she did not approve of me. When Leo brought me home, a quiet girl from the low country with big dreams and a soft voice, Esther looked at me and saw weakness. She was polite. Always. But there was a distance in her eyes. A constante évaluation. She loved her son fiercely, and she did not believe I was strong enough to stand beside him. Strong enough to carry the Sinclair name, a name she had polished with her own blood and sweat. For years, I tried to win her over. I learned her recipes. I listened to her stories. I helped at the store after my own classes. I did not argue. I did not push. I simply endured. I showed her, through quiet action, the strength she could not see. The change came slowly. So slowly, I almost didn't notice it. An extra helping of grits on my plate. A keyed question about my day. And one evening, as we sat on the porch shelling peas, she looked at me and said, "You have a good heart, Vivian, but your spine is stronger than you think." It was the closest she ever came to an apology. When she was dying, in this very house, Leo and I cared for her. One afternoon, when it was just the two of us in the room, she motioned for me to come closer. Her hand, frail and paper-thin, felt femina. Her eyes were cloudy, but her grip was firm. She said nothing. She just held my hand. That was her surrender. Her acceptance. A week before she passed, She gave the ring to Leo. It was in a small, worn velvet box. I was in the doorway when he knelt by her bedside. I heard her voice. A dry whisper. But it was as strong as steel. "Leo," she said, "give this to her when she proves she can carry our name." That night, after the nurses had left and the house was quiet, Leo came to me in the living room. He held the velvet box in his palm. His eyes were full of a love that still makes my heart ache. He opened the box. The diamonds seemed to capture all the light in the room. It was magnificent. "My mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "told me to give this to you when you proved yourself." He took the ring from the box. His fingers gentle, he took my left hand, and as he slid the ring onto my finger, he looked directly into my eyes and said, "To me, you never had to prove a thing." A deep breath, a slight pause. That is the story of the ring. It is not a story of carrots and clarity. It is a story of a woman's fight for her place. A story of a husband's unwavering love. It is the story of my becoming a Sinclair. It sits on my finger not as a decoration, but as a testament, a medal, won in a long, quiet war. So you see, when Cassandra Thorne put her fingers on that ring, she wasn't just touching a piece of jewelry. She was putting her hands on my history, my struggle, my acceptance. She looked at a symbol of my entire life's journey and saw nothing but a shiny object she could use to impress strangers. She was trying to wear my soul on her finger. That is a violation that money cannot measure. It is a theft of something far more precious than diamonds. It's a pain I wouldn't wish on anyone. Have you ever felt like a part of your own history was being erased by someone you loved? I'd be interested to read your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter. The party falls apart. The call came just as I was pouring my second glass of tea. The sun had begun to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the garden. It was Frank. His voice was different. The calm, lawyerly tone was gone, replaced by something sharp. "Breathless. Vivian," he said, and I could hear the noise of a crowd behind him. A chaotic murmur of voices. "It's done. They've made contact." I leaned forward in my chair, my knuckles white on the armrest. "Tell me. Frank, tell me everything." He was there. He had gone to the hotel. Not as my lawyer, but as a guest, a donor. He wanted to see it himself. And now, he was my eyes and ears. They were professionals. "Viv," he began, his words rushing to keep up with the events. Two of them, detectives from the Property Crimes Division. They didn't storm in. They were quiet. They looked like two businessmen who had just stepped out of a board meeting. They moved through that glittering crowd, and nobody even noticed them until they were standing right beside Julian and Cassandra's table. I closed my eyes. I could picture it. The crystal chandeliers, the string quartet playing something soft and forgettable, Cassie, holding court. Her laughter bright and artificial. The lead detective, a man named Miller, leaned in and spoke to her quietly. Frank continued. I was at the next table. I heard most of it. He said they needed to speak with her about a piece of property. And Vivian, this is exactly what you predicted. She didn't panic. She smiled. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. It was a performance, Frank said, his voice a mix of disgust and awe. She put her hand on Julian's arm, looked at the detectives with this wide-eyed, pitying expression. And she said it. She actually said it. "Oh, gentlemen, I am so sorry you were called out here. My mother-in-law, she's not been well. Her memory is failing her. This is just a sad, unfortunate cry for help. Enfrey, the trap she had set for me, the narrative she had been building for years, whispered into my son's ear. She was deploying it now. In public, as her shield, Julian looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Frank narrated. He started to apologize to the detectives, to smooth things over, but Miller didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes fixed on Cassandra. And then, He dropped the bomb. Frank paused. And for a second, I could only hear the chaos in the background. A woman's voice, rising in pitch, he said, "Ma'am, we are not here about a misunderstanding. We are investigating the theft of a 5-carat pink diamond, insured for $3 million. Vivian." The silence. I have never heard a silence like it in a room full of 300 people. The music stopped. Every fork, every glass, was frozen in midair. You could feel the entire room lean in to listen. $3 million. The number, the weapon, Cassandra's face? Frank said, his voice low. It just collapsed. The confident smile, the pity. It all just melted away, and what was left was ugly. It was pure. Naket bonits. She stammered something about it being a worthless old ring. An heirloom. Ali. And what did the detective do? I whispered. My throat tight. He didn't argue. He just held up a file. We have the appraisal, the insurance policy, and the sworn statement from the owner right here, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a razor. Now, Mrs. Thorne, you can either give us the ring and come with us quietly, or we can make this a much more public spectacle. But it was already too late for that. The noise in the background of the call swelled. I could hear shouting now. A woman's shriek. It was her. It was Cassie. She lost it. Frank said. His voice strained. She started screaming. Screaming at the detectives. Screaming at Julian. Do something, she was yelling. Are you going to let your senile mother ruin our lives? It was the worst thing she could have done. The mask was completely off. The elegant, composed socialite was gone. All that was left was a cornered animal. And that was when the party truly fell apart. The quiet observation turned into a feeding frenzy. The whispers became gasps. And the phones came out, dozens of them, little rectangles of light, held up to capture the downfall. They're escorting her out now, Frank said, his voice grim. Julian is just standing there. It looks like a ghost. He's not even looking at her. He's just staring at nothing. Vivian. It's over. Her reputation, her social standing, it was all incinerated in about 5 minutes. I listened to the chaos on the other end of the line. The shouting, the murmurs of the crowd, the sound of a world breaking. I had lit the match, and now, the fire was raging. The bitter truth. The sound of his key in the lock was heavier than I had ever heard it. It was past midnight. The house was still, holding its breath just as it had for the past 10 years. I was sitting in the dark kitchen, a single small lamp casting a pool of soft light on the old wooden table. I had made a pot of coffee, the chicory scent thick in the air, a habit from a lifetime of waiting up for someone. First Leo, then Julian. He walked in. Not like the master of the house, but like a trespasser. His tuxedo was loosened at the neck. His shoulders slumped. He looked diminished. He didn't turn on the main lights. He just came and sat down in the chair opposite me. In the pale glow of the lamp, he didn't look at me. His eyes, the same deep brown eyes as his father's placents, were fixed on the dark, swirling liquid in the coffee pot. We sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. It was the same silence we had lived in for years. But this time, it was different. It was not a silence of avoidance. It was a silence filled with everything that had finally been said out loud in a ballroom across town. I had imagined this moment 100 times. I thought I would be angry. I thought I would shout. That I would finally let loose the decade of hurt I had held inside. But when I finally spoke, my voice was quiet. It was tired. I did not ask about the party. I did not ask about the police. I did not ask about Cassandra. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised to be a good man, a strong man, and I asked him about himself. Julian, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Look at me. Slowly, He lifted his head. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked lost. A 40-year-old man who looked like a boy caught in a lie. "Did you know?" I asked. "Just that. Did you know?" It was the only question that mattered. He flinched, as if the quiet words were a physical blow. He opened his mouth, then closed it. A tear escaped from the corner of his eye and traced a slow path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "Mom. He started, his voice cracking. "I didn't know about the ring. I swear. I had no idea it was worth so much." I just looked at him. I didn't say a word. I let the silence press in on him. I waited. He broke. The confession came out in a torrent of shame. A flood held back for years. It wasn't a single admission. It was 100 small ones. He told me he knew Cassandra was in debt. Deep debt. He'd seen the credit card statements she tried to hide. The ones with balances that made his architect's salary look like pocket money. He knew her influencer lifestyle. The designer clothes, the lavish trips. He knew it was all built on a foundation of lies. I was going to help her. He stammered, his words tumbling over each other. I was going to use some of my savings. I didn't know how to bring it up. She gets so defensive. My heart grew cold. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just listened. "And the other things," he said, his voice dropping so low I could barely hear him. "The small things. Your brook. The silver locket." He looked at me then, his eyes pleading. I saw it. "Mom. The brooch. I saw it for sale on one of those luxury consignment websites she's always on. I told myself it was just a similar one. A coincidence. I didn't want to believe." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to say what he had done, or rather, what he had not done. He had seen the evidence of his wife stealing from his mother, and he had chosen to look away. He had chosen his own comfort over my dignity. He had chosen an easy lie over a hard truth. I had my answer. He knew. Maybe not everything, but he knew enough. I felt a profound sadness settle in my bones. A weariness that went deeper than anger. Anger would have been easier. Anger is a fire. It keeps you warm. This was a cold, empty space. I looked at my son, this stranger sitting at my kitchen table, and I finally understood. The enemy wasn't just Cassandra's cruelty. It was Julian's weakness. The silence. "Julian," I said, and my own voice sounded distant to me, as if it were coming from across the room. It trembled. Just a little. A single, hairline crack in the calm I had held on to all night. Her cruelty. I could almost understand it. Greed is simple. Envy is simple. I took a slow breath. "But your silence is what truly broke my heart." He didn't answer. He just lowered his head into his hands and began to sob. Not quiet tears, but deep, ragged, wrenching sobs. The sound of a man whose entire world had just collapsed inward. I stood up. My legs felt heavy, like they were carved from stone. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving him there with his grief. I climbed the stairs. Each step an effort. I went into my room and closed the door. But I could still hear him crying. I had won. I had exposed the lies. I had reclaimed my power. But as I sat on the edge of my bed in the quiet, dark house, I had never, in my entire life, felt so completely and utterly alone. The anatomy of silence. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Julian finally came home. The police station had been a blur of fluorescent lights and the smell of stale coffee. Cassandra had been released on her own recognizance. Pending a formal arraignment, Frank had handled everything with a grim efficiency. I did not go. There was nothing for me to say there. Everything I needed to say here. In this house, I was in the kitchen, sitting at the old oak table where Julian used to do his homework. I had made a pot of coffee. Not for him. For me. The aroma, rich and dark with chicory, filled the silence. It was a familiar comfort in a world that suddenly felt alien. He walked in, not looking at me. His expensive tuxedo was rumpled. His tie loosened. He looked diminished. A man who had just seen the foundations of his life turn to dust. He walked to the sink, turned on the tap, and drank a glass of water in one long swallow, as if he was trying to wash away the taste of the night. The silence in the room was heavy. It was a physical thing. You could feel the weight of it in your chest. For years, I had learned to navigate his silences, to tiptoe around them, but not tonight. Tonight, I was going to walk right through the middle of it. He finally turned, leaning back against the counter. He still wouldn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the dark window, where his own tired reflection stared back at him. "Mom," he began, his voice hoarse. I can't believe you did that." My hands were wrapped around my coffee mug. The warmth was grounding. I did not raise my voice. I did not move. "I didn't do this." "Julian," I said. My voice was level, flat. "Cassandra did this. And you watched her." He finally looked at me then. His eyes were pleading, full of a desperate exhaustion I knew so well. "What was I supposed to do?" She said. She was borrowing it. How could I know? I held up a hand. A small, simple gesture, but it stopped him cold. "I am not going to ask you what you didn't know," I said, my voice still quiet, still flat. "I am going to ask you what you did know." He stared at me. The pleading in his eyes was replaced by confusion and fear. "What did you know?" "Julian," I repeated. I did not blink. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He ran a hand through his hair. He looked away again. Back to the window, back to his own reflection. "I knew," he started, his voice barely a whisper. "I knew she was unhappy." "Unhappy," I said. "No, that's not the word I'm looking for. Let's try another one. Did you know she was in debt?" He flinched, a small, almost imperceptible tightening of his shoulders. But I saw it. I had been watching him for a lifetime. I knew all his tells. "Answer me." "Julian." He swallowed hard. "There were bills," he admitted, the words coming out as if they were being pulled from him. "Credit card statements. Sometimes they came here by mistake. The amounts were large." "Large," I repeated. Not a question. A statement. I took a slow sip of coffee. It was bitter. "And when you saw these large bills for clothes and trips, I knew your salary couldn't cover. What did you do?" I asked her about it," he said, his voice defensive now. "She said she was handling it, that she had her influencer income. She said it was an investment in her brand." "An investment?" I said. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. "And you believed her?" I wanted to believe her. He shot back, his voice rising. Because it was easier, I finished for him. My voice still quiet. The quiet was my weapon now. He was shouting into a void. I let that silence sit for a moment. I let it press down on him. Then, I asked the next question. "What about my things?" "Julian." "Your things?" he asked, confused. "Yes, my things. The things that have been disappearing from this house for the last 2 years. He looked at me, his face a picture of genuine bewilderment. "What are you talking about, Mom?" You misplace things sometimes. You know that." And there it was. Her voice. Her words. Coming out of my son's mouth. The story she had so carefully constructed. The narrative of my decline. My voice became colder, sharper. Did I misplace my mother's silver locket, the one I kept in the top drawer of my dresser? Did I misplace the pair of pearl earrings your father gave me for our 20th anniversary? Did I misplace the brooch that I wore to your college? Graduation. With each item I listed, the color drained a little more from his face, because he remembered. I could see it in his eyes. He remembered me looking for them. He remembered Cassie's placating voice. "Oh, Viv probably put it somewhere safe and forgot. Last year, I continued, my voice relentless. You saw my locket for sale on a high-end consignment website, didn't you? Julian, he looked as though I had slapped him. His mouth fell open. He just stared at me. You saw it. I said, you sent me the link. You said, Mom, look at this. It looks just like yours. And I told you it couldn't be. Because mine was safe in my drawer. But it wasn't in my drawer. Was it? And you knew it. Deep down, you knew it. But you closed the browser. You let it go. Because it was easier, he finally broke. He slid down the counter until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. A choke had escaped him. I didn't know what to do. He whispered, his voice muffled by his hands. I didn't want to believe it. He looked up at me, his face wet with tears. A face I hadn't seen since he was a small boy who'd fallen off his bike. I just wanted to keep the peace. Mom, I looked at my son, this 40-year-old man crying on my kitchen floor. The anger I thought I would feel wasn't there. There was only a vast, empty space where my heart used to be. Your peace, I said. And my voice was so quiet it was almost a whisper. Or hers. He didn't answer. It just sobbed, because the price of your peace was my sanity. Julian, I said, the words falling like ice chips into the silence. You stood by. You watched her convince me. And you, that I was losing my mind. You let her carve pieces out of me, day after day. And you said nothing, because you wanted peace. I stood up from the table. The coffee in my mug was cold now. Well, I said, walking to the sink. Look around you. Here it is. All that peace you bought. The reckoning. I stayed in my room for what felt like hours. The crying from downstairs eventually subsided, replaced by the same heavy silence as before, but it was a different silence now. It was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting is done. The silence of wreckage. I sat on the edge of my bed, my hands folded in my lap, and I thought, anger is a simple, clean fire. It burns hot and bright, and then it burns out. But what I felt was not anger. It was a sorrow so deep it felt like a part of my own bones. I was mourning, not for the son I had lost tonight, but for the son I had been losing bit by bit for 10 years, without ever admitting it to myself. I was mourning the strong, good man I thought I had raised. When I finally went back downstairs, he was still there, in the same chair. The lamp cast long shadows across his face. He looked up as I entered, and his eyes were the eyes of a stranger. They were empty. All the practiced charm, the easygoing confidence, it was all gone. All that was left was the raw, hollowed-out look of a man who has finally been forced to see himself clearly. He watched me as I walked to the sink and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were steady now. The tremor was gone. What do I do now? Mom, he asked, his voice raw. Broken. How do I fix this? How do I fix this? The question hung in the quiet kitchen. He was asking me for a map, for instructions, the same way he had asked me how to build his model airplanes as a boy, how to tie his first tie. He was a 40-year-old man, and he was still asking his mother to make it better. I remember the day I taught him how to ride his bicycle without training wheels. He was 6 years old. I held onto the back of the seat, running behind him down the sidewalk, my own heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. Don't let go. Mama, he'd yelled, promise you won't let go. And at some point, my hand was no longer on the seat. He was pedaling on his own. He wobbled. He swerved. And then, he was riding. He was flying. He turned back to look at me. A grin of pure, triumphant joy on his face. He had done it himself. I looked at him now. This man in my kitchen, and I realized with a sudden, painful clarity that for the last 10 years, he had never taken his hands off the training wheels. He had let Cassandra be his balance. He had let my silence be his comfort. He had never learned to pedal through the hard parts on his own. The anger I thought was gone flickered inside me again. A small, hot coal, but it was aimed at myself this time. By staying quiet for the sake of his peace. Had I been holding onto the back of his bicycle all this time, had my silence kept him from growing up? He was waiting for an answer. For a list of things to do: apologize, make restitution, choose a side, fix it. He wanted me to tell him how to be a good son again. He wanted me to absolve him, but absolution is not mine to give, and a map would be useless. This was a wilderness he had to navigate by himself. This was his reckoning. Not mine. I took a slow sip of water. It was cool and clean. I set the glass down on the counter with a soft click. That, I said, and my voice was gentle, but it was as firm as bedrock. That is a question you need to answer for yourself. Julian. He stared at me, his eyes wide with confusion. This was not the answer he expected. Not for me. I continued, each word chosen with care. Not for Cassandra. For yourself. You need to sit in this wreckage that you helped create. And you need to decide what kind of man you are going to be when you stand up from it. I walked to the kitchen doorway and paused, my hand on the frame. When you figure that out, I'll be here. I am your mother, and I will always be here. I turned to look at him one last time, but I will not be your peacekeeper anymore. I will not make this easy for you. That part of my life is over. He sat there, a grown man utterly lost, and in that moment, the anger in me subsided, replaced by a profound and heavy sorrow. The journey ahead for both of us felt impossibly long. If you are still here with me, listening to my story, would you do me a kindness and comment with the "I'm with you"? Below, I just need to know that there are friends walking this path with me. Your presence is the greatest encouragement for me to tell you how this all ends. The price of lies. The days that followed were quiet. An unnatural quiet. Julian moved into one of the guest rooms, the one at the far end of the hall. We moved around each other in this big, silent house, like two ghosts. We were polite. We were careful. We said good morning and good night. But the space between us was filled with the wreckage of things left unsaid for a decade. Most of what I knew, I learned from Frank. He would call me in the late afternoons. His voice was all business. A calm, steady anchor in the storm. He spoke in the precise, unemotional language of the law. He told me about depositions and discovery, about motions and plea bargains. It was all very clean, very orderly. A sterile vocabulary for a very messy truth. It was during one of those calls that Frank told me about Cassandra's other lawyer. She didn't just have a divorce attorney on retainer. Vivian, he said, his voice flat. For the last 6 months, she's been consulting with a firm that specializes in elder law. I was sitting in Leo's study, looking out at the rain. Elder law, I repeated. The words felt strange in my mouth. Specifically, Frank continued, and I could hear the rustle of papers on his end of the line. She was inquiring about the legal process for establishing guardianship, for declaring an individual mentally incompetent to manage their own affairs. There it was, the final piece, the cold, hard, legal confirmation of the plan she had been executing with her soft voice and her concerned smiles. The misplaced keys, the forgotten appointments, the constant, gentle suggestions that my memory was failing. It hadn't just been casual cruelty, it had been a strategy. Each incident was a carefully laid stone in the path to proving I was losing my mind. The theft of the ring, that was meant to be her masterpiece. Her final, irrefutable proof. She never intended to sell it. She intended to use it as an exhibit. Exhibit A. The paranoid delusions of a senile old woman. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rainy day. It was the chilling realization of just how close I had come to being completely erased, to being a ward in my own home. My life and my husband's legacy, managed by the woman who despised me most. She had not just been trying to steal my property. She had been trying to steal myself. My personhood. The evidence against her is overwhelming. Vivian, Frank said, pulling me back from the edge of that dark thought. The text message, the documented history of selling your other items. And now this premeditated plan to have you declared incompetent. Her lawyer knows she doesn't stand a chance in court. And so, she took a deal, a plea bargain. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of grand larceny. In exchange, the other potential charges would be dropped. There would be no public trial, no dramatic courtroom testimony. It would all be handled quietly. With the signing of papers, part of me, a small, dark part, was disappointed. I had wanted her to face a jury. I had wanted her to have to look me in the eye as I told my story. But another part of me was just tired. The fight had taken more out of me than I realized. A quiet end felt like a mercy. That same week, Julian came to me. He found me in the kitchen, where I was making a pot of red beans and rice, an old comfort food. He didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets. He looked thinner, older. "I have an appointment," he said. His voice was quiet, but it was steady. "On Thursday, with a therapist." I didn't stop stirring the pot. The motion was rhythmic, soothing. "That's good." "Julian," I said. He nodded, as if my approval was something he needed but hadn't expected. "And," he continued, taking a breath, "I've hired an attorney. I told him to file for divorce this morning." I stopped stirring then. I turned to look at him. He was looking directly at me. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking away. He wasn't asking for my permission. He was informing me of a decision he had made, a decision about his own life. I just nodded. I didn't say I'm glad. I didn't say, it's about time. His journey back to himself had to be his own. It had nothing to do with me. "The beans will be ready in an hour," I said, turning back to the stove. "Okay," he said. I'll be here." It was not a resolution. It was not forgiveness. But it was something. It was the first tentative step onto solid ground after the earthquake. He was, finally, answering his own question. He was figuring out what to do. Alone. And in that moment, for the first time since that terrible night, I felt a flicker of something that felt almost like hope. It was small. It was fragile. But it was there. The new quiet. It has been 3 months. 3 months since the night the silence in this house broke, only to be replaced by a different kind. A new quiet. This quiet is not heavy. It does not hum with unspoken resentments. It is spacious. It holds the sound of the morning sun slanting through the kitchen windows, the soft rustle of newspaper pages, the distant chime of a wind chime on the porch. It is the sound of a house breathing again. The weeks after that night were a blur of legalities. Frank handled most of it. His voice a calm, steady presence on the phone, translating the cold language of the law into something I could understand. Cassandra took a plea bargain. The evidence was absolute, irrefutable. Her meticulously planned narrative of my decline became the prosecution's strongest exhibit of her premeditation. She is serving her sentence now, in a place far from the glittering ballroom she loved. I do not think of her often. When I do, it is with a strange, detached pity, a sadness for a woman who had so much, yet understood so little of its worth. My focus has not been on the past. It has been on the present, on this new, quiet life that is taking shape. One day, a few weeks after the arraignment, I found myself driving, with no real destination in mind. I ended up at the local community center, a place I hadn't been to in years. I walked in, and I saw a group of seniors gathered around a table, looking confused and anxious, their hands full of papers they couldn't make sense of. Insurance forms, loan applications, legal notices. I recognized the look in their eyes. It was the look of people who felt invisible, the look of people whose experience was being dismissed, whose intelligence was being underestimated. And without thinking, I walked over. Perhaps I can help, I said, and so, a new routine was born. Twice a week, I go to the center. I sit at that table, and I help them read the fine print. I explain what a beneficiary is. I help them fill out forms to protect their pensions. I am not a lawyer. And I tell them that I am just a woman who has learned the hard way about the importance of knowing your rights. I am a translator. I translate the language of power into the language of my peers, and in their gratitude, in the way their shoulders relax when they finally understand. I have found a purpose that I didn't know I was looking for. Julian is finding his own way. He has not moved back in. That would be too easy. A retreat into old patterns. He has his own apartment across town, but he is present in this house now. In a way he hasn't been since he was a boy. Last Saturday, he showed up unannounced. Dressed in old jeans and a sweatshirt, he was holding a pair of heavy gardening gloves. The roses, he said. Simply, Dad's roses. They look like they need some help. Cassandra had always hated that rose garden. She'd said it was old-fashioned, that she wanted to tear it out and put in a swimming pool. For years, I had watched Leo's prize-winning roses grow tangled and weak from neglect. We spent the entire day in the dirt. We didn't talk much. There was no need. We worked. We pulled weeds, pruned the deadwood, turned the soil. His hands, an architect's hands, so used to clean lines and perfect angles, were covered in dirt and scratched by thorns. I showed him how his father used to feed the soil, the way he would talk to the plants as he worked, and in the shared, qui élabore, something began to mend. It was not forgiveness. It was not forgetting. It was rebuilding, side by side, in the silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, the silence of shared work, of a shared history. At the end of the day, we sat on the porch steps, drinking lemonade, watching the sun set over the garden we had saved together. I'm thinking of taking a new project at work, he said, breaking the quiet. He explained the details. A complex renovation of a historic building downtown. It was a big step for him. A chance to lead his own team. After he finished, he looked at me, his gaze direct, steady. What do you think, he asked. It was such a simple question, but it was the first time in 10 years he had asked for my opinion on something that truly mattered to him. He wasn't asking for my approval. He was asking for my insight. He was treating me not as a fragile old woman, but as a partner in conversation. As an equal, I thought about it. I considered the risks, the challenges, the potential rewards, and I gave him my honest answer. I think your father would have loved the challenge, I said, and I think you are ready for it. A small smile touched his lips, a real one, not the practiced, easy smile he had worn for years. This one was quiet, and it reached his eyes. Thanks, Mom, he said. The path ahead is not clear. The wounds are still there. Scars. I have learned. Do not disappear. They become a part of the landscape of who you are. But for the first time, in a very long time, I feel a sense of hope. A fragile hope, perhaps. Like the first new bud on a rosebush you thought was dead, but it is there. In this new quiet, something is beginning to grow again. Visible, it has been a year, 12 months. A full circle of seasons has passed over this old house, and its quiet garden, each one leaving its mark. I have watched the fiery autumn leaves of the maple tree turn to lace, fall, and then return as tender green fists in the spring. The azaleas have bloomed twice. A riot of pink and white against the dark soil. The world keeps turning. I have learned, it does not stop for our private griefs, or for our quiet victories. Change is a slow, patient thing, until one day you look up from your life and realize everything is different. My phone rang this morning. Its cheerful chime, a sound I no longer dread. It was a woman from the community center. A Mrs. Gable. I remembered her from my first weeks there. A small, bird-like woman with eyes that were clouded with a fear she could not name. Her son had been pressuring her to sign some papers. Something about a reverse mortgage. Her voice then had been a whisper, thin as thread. Today, her voice was strong. It was clear. I wanted you to know. Vivian, she said. And I could hear the smile in her words. I took your advice. I had my own lawyer look at everything. We put a stop to it. He was not happy. But my home is safe. She paused, and then added, You gave me the courage. You helped me remember that my signature, my name, still means something. We talked for a while longer. Two women who had learned the language of fine print, who had refused to be silenced by the people who were supposed to love us most. When I hung up the phone, I sat there in the sunlit kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, and I thought about the strange arithmetic of life, how we pour everything we have into our children. We teach them how to hold a fork, how to tie their shoes, how to be kind to strangers. We teach them everything, except the most important lesson of all, how to treat us when we are no longer the strong center of their world. We assume they will just know. We wrap ourselves in the warm blanket of our love for them and believe it is enough to protect us. But I have learned that love is not a blanket. It is a garden. It needs tending. It needs strong fences. My silence? The silence I had offered up for 10 years on the altar of my son's peace was not a nurturing rain. It was a slow poison. It was a quiet, daily instruction to both him and his wife that my feelings, my history, my very presence, did not require respect. It was permission. Julian came by for dinner last night. This is our new rhythm. Every Tuesday. He doesn't just show up anymore. He calls first, Is tonight still good for you? Mom, he'll ask. A small question. A universe of respect contained within it. He brings groceries. Usually something he knows I like but don't often buy for myself. Like a good loaf of sourdough bread or fresh Gulf shrimp. He has started to fix the little things around the house that have been broken for years. The loose banister on the back stairs. The screen door that never quite closed right. He is slowly, quietly, repairing the house his father built. Repairing the home he allowed to fall into disrepair. We were sitting on the porch after we ate. The air thick and sweet with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. The fireflies had begun their silent, blinking conversation in the twilight. He had been quiet for a while, just watching the sky bleed from deep blue into a soft, bruised purple. I was talking to my therapist today, he said, his voice low. The words, not easy. We were talking about patterns, avoidance. I told him that for 10 years, I worked so hard to keep the peace in a marriage that had no peace in it. There was only tension, quiet, grinding tension that I chose to ignore every single day. He turned to look at me, and his eyes, his father's eyes, were clear. The hunted look that had lived in them for so long was finally gone. I'm realizing now that being a grown-up, really being a man, isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about choosing which battles are worth fighting. It's about protecting your own. He looked down at his hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. And I didn't fight for you. Mom, I know that. I chose the easier path. Every single time, he took a slow breath. The sound of it filling the quiet space between us. I will have to live with that. That's my truth to carry. Forever. But I'm learning. Finally. How to fight for the right things now. I'm learning what's worth protecting. I didn't say anything. Words felt too small for the moment. I just reached out and put my hand on his. It was the first time we had touched with such intention, with such meaning. Since the night, everything broke. His hand was warm, and it felt steady, strong. He wrapped his fingers around mine and squeezed gently. And in that simple, quiet gesture, a decade of distance, of misunderstanding, of unspoken hurt, began to fall away like old, dry leaves. Later, long after he had gone home, I sat in the garden for a long time by myself, wrapped in one of Leo's old sweaters. The ring is locked away in a bank vault now. It is a cold, safe, sterile place. My finger feels bare without its familiar weight, but I do not miss it. I have come to understand that its value was never in the wearing of it. Its value was in the story it held, a story of acceptance and love that I now carry inside me. It is a part of my bones. It cannot be borrowed. It cannot be stolen. I looked around at the other houses in the neighborhood, their windows glowing like soft, yellow eyes in the darkness. I thought about Cassandra, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something like understanding, not forgiveness, but a kind of sad recognition. I thought about the world that had shaped her, this frantic, noisy world that screams at us from 1,000 different screens, telling us that our worth is measured not by who we are, but by what others can see. The perfect house, the perfect body, the perfect life, all filtered and cropped and curated for public approval. They sell us a dream of effortless perfection, and we go into debt, financial and moral, to buy it. Piece by piece, they taught Cassandra to want everything: the clothes, the status, the recognition, the envy of strangers. They just forgot to teach her how to want a quiet soul. My name is Vivian Sinclair. I am 67 now. The ring is locked away, but I have never felt more valuable. The silence in this house is no longer empty. It is not a silence of absence. It is a silence of presence. It is full of the sound of my own breathing, the turning of pages in a good book, the contented sigh of a woman at peace in her own home. It is full of the memory of my son's laughter from the night before, a sound I thought I might never hear again. It is full of me. After a lifetime of learning, of loving, of losing, and of finding again, I am finally, completely, visible. And so, Vivian Sinclair's story comes to a close, a story of silence, and of finding a voice when it was needed most. It makes you think, doesn't it? What do you think of Vivian's final decision? To choose a path of quiet strength and rebuilding, rather than pure revenge. If you were in her shoes, seeing your son so broken, would you have done anything differently? Please, share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly do read every single one, and your perspectives give these stories a life beyond the final word. If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel something or think a little deeper, I would be so grateful if you would leave a like. It helps more than you know. Share it with someone who you believe would be moved by Vivian's journey. And of course, subscribe to Deepu Cater Stories and turn on notifications, so you don't miss the next mystery we unravel together. I'll see you in the next story. And who knows, maybe next time, the story will be about you.